So welcome to Pax Europiana, this time from the House of Independence of the Republic of Kosovo. I'm honored to have a representative from the Ministry of Culture here, Bekim Gashi. He is also a full-time historian and he is very knowledgeable. There's a new exposition about the whole narrative of Kosovo independence. I will guide you through it, and first a short welcome from Mr. Gashi, please.
Mirë se vjeni në shtëpinë e pavarësisë Dr. Ibrahim Rugova, pra në muzeun shtëpia pavarësisë Dr. Ibrahim Rugova, mund ta vizitoni. Emrin shtëpia pavarësisë Ibrahim Rugova e ka marrën nga vetë presidenti Rugova për në vitin 2002, sepse gjithë puna 10 vjeçare e politikës paçore të presidentit Rugova është kryer në këtë objekt që sot është muzej.
I'm very honored, and he is welcoming us very much to this House of Independence of Ibrahim Rugova. This was Albanian, by the way. It's a complicated language. I tried to learn it since 10 years, and I'm very happy that we have this guide. I will guide you now through this museum. First of all, here is the bust of Mr. Rugova, the historic president, the founder of the First Republic, and also that's the building basically, that was the government building, the parliament building, the Writers Association. This is basically the heart of the Kosovo independence struggle. It's the same building as it was in the beginning, and I will now explain you step by step exactly the history. It will take about half an hour to guide you through the history of the Republic, and I will do my best to do this as best as I can. Here you see, this is the very well done photo exhibition, explanation, and I will now, which is actually a friend of mine has done that very beautifully, and I will now start here. This is basically the development of the historic history. Everything is well described, ancient Byzantinian history. Let's never forget, it's all Byzantinian, it's all the Roman Empire here. And then the fall of the Roman Empire has led to the various puzzles and puzzle pieces of the Roman Empire, of the Byzantinian Eastern Orthodox Empire, to develop differently. And then obviously they started to fight throughout the time. Then came the time of the Ottoman conquest. It's very well represented here. Never forget, it was the shield of Christendom. That was Skanderbeg. He tried to defend, but we didn't help enough, or we didn't have the power to project at that time. And then gradually, after the Napoleonic Wars, there was then gradually, country by country, the independence of the various Balkan nations. Obviously first with Romania and Serbia, and then also Montenegro in the Berlin Congress, and the struggle up to then is well described here in this House of Independence. Here you see what I always talk about, they see it as annexation, not as liberation. This has to be understood. Obviously Serbia thought it's a liberation of historic place, but after 600 years, or in a way 600 years, yeah, of occupation by the Turks, then it was a replacement of the occupation by Belgrade, and it was of course going with this first big genocide. Actually the first genocide, Albin Kurti has referred in the dialogue, never forget, happened exactly at 1878, and because that was the moment of the Berlin Congress, and then Serbia was extended towards the south, towards Niš, and there were a lot of Albanians living. They were all treated with ethnic cleansing and disaster. That was the first one. And then obviously the second one, when Albania got independence 1912, Kosovo was integrated into Serbia, annexed, and it was obviously the big disaster for the people here. That was the second genocide that Mr. Kurti, the Prime Minister, has referred to. Here you see all the flags, very beautiful museum, it's very well done. And then we come to the history of Yugoslavia. Maybe here already Tito, you see the time, the Second World War, and here the time of Yugoslavia. It was basically until the mid-60s, Yugoslavia went bankrupt, and then they were going more and more under American tutelage in the Cold War. Obviously also with the split between Stalin and Tito in '48, but then fully in the mid of the 60s. The period in the beginning was very hard. It's called the Rankovic time. He was a very brutal military police state here, and then it softened up under American pressure in '66. And then this led then to the autonomy status for Kosovo. That's what they call the good times. Obviously it was still complicated, but at least there were basic rights here in Kosovo. They had their own status to some extent, and this 70s there was also the opening of the Austrian and German labor market. so things were developing actually in some kind of decent livelihood. The first start of some modest prosperity was possible, and then everything, of course, in the rise of nationalism in the 80s and the terrible takeover of Milosevic in 87, when he basically used the Serb nationalism very much from Kosovo here to take power in Serbia, and then the end of the autonomy in 89, the Trepča strike. I have outlined that, I've discussed all this in my Twitter account already, but I think here it's very well preserved. You will not be beaten again. Milosevic using this kind of toxic, violent energy of the Serb minority here, who were then basically driving him to power. He built this coalition against Stambolic. There's wonderful YouTube videos out there where Stambolic is calling Milosevic, if he's crazy, he's breaking up Yugoslavia, and that's what he did. It was very much his personal power play of Milosevic on the back of the Kosovo people, actually abusing even the Serbs here, but using this Serb minority then to get this so-called anti-bureaucratic revolution, which was basically his personal power game to run the country. Milosevic killed later Stambolic, as I have also outlined on Twitter in some of my tweets, but his dead body was found after the war, and he was basically his political father. Stambolic made Milosevic, and Milosevic killed his own political father then later. Very tragic what kind of violence used on all sides. Yeah? Here obviously Rankovic, the military dictator of Kosovo during until 66, the Americans, or 64, the Americans basically have taken him out under the pressure of the financing agreement and the so-called hard dinner phase. I have economics play a really big role in the history of Yugoslavia and Kosovo, and the currency obviously as well. And here you see a lot of the violence which was committed against the Albanians. They were citizens of this state, and they were second or third or fourth-rate citizens, and it was a terrible phase, and that's what I refer as in history as anti-bureaucratic revolution. This was basically the power play of Milosevic on these toxic minority issues, and he then took power in Yugoslavia, and he declared war on all non-Serbs and everybody else who was opposing him. It was not only the non-Serbs, maybe that must be also correctly explained, because many of the Serbs who were opposing Milosevic's power play and his declaration of war against actually the free world, against the non-Serbs in Yugoslavia, but also against everybody in Serbia who opposed him and who was not sharing his wild, extreme, toxic mixture between socialism and nationalism. He was also killing many of them. Stambolic is the best example, but so many. That's now the Kazim Mestan speech, 600 years, and riling up the people on this extreme nationalism was obviously his case here. And he basically, while the rest of the world, the Cold War was ending, and the Prague embassies and all these historic things, I will show you the photo of Mok. They really like Alois Mok here as well. He opened the Cold War in '89. Milosevic started the hot war here in the Balkans. That led to the end of Yugoslavia and to the destruction of the system which made Milosevic big, but he said he wants a different form of ideological base, and it led to this war, first in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and then Kosovo. Milosevic started 4 wars, and it was a disaster. He brought over his own people and over Europe and all his neighbors and different nationalities. Here's Ibrahim Rugova, the father of independence of Kosovo, already starting the LDK here in '89. At the same time, where so many independence and freedom movements and first parties have started all over Eastern Europe, everything could have gone normal also, with a normal situation in the breakup of Yugoslavia. But Serb ethno-nationalism didn't allow that. They wanted to destroy this order and impose their own. And then obviously the non-violence struggle of Ibrahim Rugova here very well documented. And then the start of segregation, I call it apartheid. I think it's a better word to explain in English what has really happened. The Albanians were then treated as third-class citizens and not even as citizens. They were basically suppressed and discriminated very heavily in all public institutions, and that was basically from the 90s towards the liberation by NATO arms in 99. Here you see many of the most famous friends of Kosovo in the human rights. Here Natasha Kandic, a European personality who fought for freedom and human rights in ex-Yugoslavia. Many of the associations are honored here who were fighting for freedom in this country and all over former Yugoslavia. I actually don't know all of them, but I think it's really worth coming and to honor them. And also the religious leaders were calling for peace and the start of pluralism, obviously politically. Here you see the political development of Kosovo in this decisive year in 98 and 1990. It's here the constitution which was declared. Here, this I learned also recently, only 2nd of Republic 1990, the idea to have an independent republic inside Yugoslavia still. This was still inside Yugoslavia, the declaration of our own republic again, like they had before already. That was the 2nd of July, that's why that's such an important memorial day. Then the 7th of September was the constitution of Kačanik. First constitution was drafted of the republic inside Yugoslavia still. Then there was the first referendum of independence, and that was on the 22nd of September 1991, and that's why I see the first declaration of independence. It was only recognized as a sovereign state then by Albania, and that was a big mistake. We should have all done that, and we could have saved so much when we intervened decisively with a clear idea to save Bosnia from war and to recognize Kosovo. It would have been much less bloody. We were weak and we believed the Serbian narratives of whatever kind of Kosovo is Serbia, and then the international community was badly briefed, didn't recognize Kosovo as they have actually Macedonia. Macedonia also declared independence on the 8th of September. It's just at the same timing. It was the 7th of September here, and then next year, now I have to make a correction, that was 1990, that was still the republic inside Yugoslavia, 91, then the independence referendum, and here on the 8th of September, just 2 weeks before, was Macedonian independence referendum, and so it all happened. We recognized Macedonia, but not Kosovo, so it took basically 17 years more of independence struggle of LDK led, and this is of course the big general independence movement led by Mr. Rugova. It transformed then in a political party. It's now part of the EPP, and now of course it's a differentiated party political system here in Kosovo with all Social Democrats, Greens and everybody. But at that time it was basically the LDK, the big movement for freedom. Here many attacks in the 90s, the idea of Serbianization and of discrimination by law, that was apartheid. I think it's the best way to describe it, this decade of apartheid, the destruction of the economic system. I mean, Yugoslavia was always a disaster economically. Let's never forget it was a socialist planned economy and it never worked. It was always subsidized by American and later German taxpayers and by the diaspora coming to our countries to work here and send remittances. But then also you see the many murders of people who were in the draft and in Yugoslavia, and there were many of them not coming back. The sons had to go to military draft, and then there were police violence and also inside the military system. Here you see the start of and this is this famous war criminal who some in Serbia still think is a hero, is invited to talk shows in Serbian state television in 2021. With Mon General, they say to him, he is a convicted criminal and he has started and he has perpetrated many mass crimes. He is the perpetrator of the genocide of Srebrenica, here Mladic, and you see here the Bosnian War, which of course played a huge role here in Kosovo. While the pressure was there to open a southern front, the military situation and the access towards the free world and the supply levels was different than in Croatia. In Croatia, the Americans could supply weapons to the freedom struggle, and they also later than in Bosnia. But here in Kosovo, in the center of the Balkans, there was little access, and the war was only then possible once in Albania there was the revolution and the breakup of the military system and the access to the weapons.